Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of our guests in the audience today, wherever you may be dialing in from. My name is Virla Nawens. I am the Senior Research Fellow in the Navigating the Indo-Pacific program here at RUSI in London. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you today to our event, Update on the South China Sea Disputes, a Transatlantic Approach. The event is organized as part of the Transatlantic Dialogue on China run by RUSI in partnership with Chatham House, with the generous support of the Carnegie Corporation of New York. The dialogue aims to encourage innovative thinking on how to address some of the tensions in the transatlantic relationship over China. In our event today, we'll be exploring how nearly 5 years after an international arbitration tribunal rule against China's maritime claims on the South China Sea, territorial disputes remain unresolved. Chinese assertive and sometimes aggressive activities at sea, including through hybrid tactics such as the use of the maritime militia, continue unabated. While China is continuing its militarization of the man-made islands it has constructed in the South China Sea, it has also sought to use other policy tools through the issuance, for example, of Chinese domestic legislation over the area in an effort to change the legal landscape of the South China Sea. This is not only of concern to countries in the region, and indeed later this year, HMS Queen Elizabeth Carrier Strike Group will be joined by ships from the Netherlands and the United States and will sail through the region. Several European countries have also issued Indo-Pacific strategies, which all underscore their concern over regional challenges to the rules-based international system, including the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. I am delighted to be joined today by two of the leading experts on the South China Sea, Mr. Bill Hayton and Mr. Greg Poling, who will offer perspectives from London and Washington on the current situation. They will seek to trace its potential evolution and attendant risks and consider avenues for transatlantic policy coordination. Bill Hayton is Associate Fellow of the Asia-Pacific Program at Chatham House in London. He focuses on the South China Sea disputes and current affairs in Southeast Asia, and has published several fantastic books, including The South China Sea, The Struggle for Power in 2014, and most recently, The Invention of China, which he published last year. Greg Poling is Senior Fellow for Southeast Asia and Director of the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. He oversees research on U.S. foreign policy in the Asia Pacific, with a particular focus on maritime domain and the countries of Southeast Asia. His research interests include the South China Sea disputes, democratization in Southeast Asia, and Asian multilateralism. Bill and Greg will each make opening remarks of around 10 minutes, after which we will open the floor to the audience for a Q&A session of around 30 minutes. To ask a question, please type your question into the Q&A box that you'll see at the bottom of your screen, and please state your name and affiliation. I'll endeavor to get through as many questions as possible, but with that, I will now hand over to Bill to give his remarks. Bill, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Phil. It's great to be here. Great to be with two real experts on the South China Sea, including yourself. I think I've characterized the way that the UK in particular has looked at the South China Sea issue in the context of its overall relations with China. Broadly, cartoon version, 3 phases, from 1840 until about 2008. China was a problem for us insofar as we thought about it at all over there. From 2008, from the Olympics, I guess, up until maybe the end of the Cameron government in 2016, it was suddenly China is wonderful and everything and is going to invest in the British economy and be a great major source of growth. And then since about 2008, since 2016, we've had a real change of attitude, a much more skeptical set of views, I think, emerging. And that's changed the way that the UK government looks at everything. I'd say maybe European-wise, the high point was probably 2010 when France sold 60 diesel engines to equip China's Type 56 frigates, and Germany sold 8 diesel engines for China's Type 52 destroyers. That maybe was the high point, I guess, of European visions of working with China. Since then, we've had a series of missteps, I think, from the Chinese side, which have increased skepticism, appearing to be predatory in industrial takeovers, failing to reciprocate European openness and investment and that kind of thing. The problems with COVID, not just the initial virus, but then difficulties with protective equipment and transparency and all the rest of it. Things like the 16+1, 17+1 framework have really annoyed Europeans. And then we've had allegations of spying and interference in the whole Huawei situation. So there's been a whole series of things, I think, which have changed the way that Western European countries view China, view Asia, view the Indo-Pacific, which have led to change in attitude and posture. And I think Japan has led a lot of the Europeans down the sort of route. Partly, we've seen, for example, going back to 2015, the Lübeck Maritime Declaration for the G7 countries. And it's, I think it's worth pointing out that 6 of the G7 countries will be engaging in some kind of sort of naval transit in the South China Sea this year. Italy's the only one that isn't going to be there. And this, I think, has led into an adoption of Japan's language about Indo-Pacific, a phrase which wasn't heard much, but has certainly superseded Asia-Pacific in British thinking. It appears that the Indo-Pacific phrase appears in the Integrated Security Review, which was published in March by the British government, the British tilt, as it says in the review, towards the Indo-Pacific. And I think it works for the Europeans because it sort of integrates their traditional interests closer to home. And when you can see the anti-piracy operations off Somalia and Eastern Africa, and how that sort of connects to a wider region, which is the South China Sea, the Pacific Islands, and everything in between. And of course, France in particular has overseas territories there, and then the rest of the European countries involved, the UK, Netherlands, and Germany, have what are nicely called historic links, imperial or otherwise, or Commonwealth connections going back, which have left a legacy of trade and connection and migration and people-to-people contact, as well as all the economic connections too. But that doesn't necessarily mean, I think, that the European publics or the British public are that well informed about Asia, or that enthusiastic about increasing security or even commercial ties. I think there's a great deficit of knowledge in terms of our interest in and dependence on East, Southeast, and South Asia. But I imagine that will develop in time, particularly as we see the Royal Navy deployment this year and other things. People will start to take more of an interest. Now, the French, I think, led the way. They were the first country to publish an Indo-Pacific strategy back in 2018. The Germans did some Indo-Pacific guidelines in September last year. The Netherlands has also published some, and we're seeing the European Union ones soon. In terms of the UK integrated review with its Indo-Pacific tilt, it highlights 3 reasons why: economic, security, and values. And interesting that it was, the whole review was authored and edited by John Bew, who's a sort of an author of a book on realpolitik, a necessary antidote to idealism in foreign policy. And I think that's the approach that we're now looking at this part of the world through. We're going to see more activism, I think, by the UK, but not just in terms of sending the naval force, the carrier strike group there. We're going to see more activism in a legal sense too, particularly on the law of the sea. We saw that with the UK, France, and Germany simultaneously publishing a note verbale at the UN about China's excessive claims in the South China Sea. And we're also seeing, in the context of the carrier strike group, going an effort to sort of, I think, really firm up relations with Malaysia and Singapore through the 5-power defense arrangements, and also with Brunei. I wouldn't say this is a wholehearted change of heart within Europe. Certainly some member states in the EU are more cautious down this. Some Central European states have been grateful for Chinese investment and attention. Some, in particular Hungary and perhaps Greece, have been more reluctant to criticize China as a result. But in some other countries, for example, the Czech Republic, China has seriously overplayed its hand and caused a very critical backlash there. But I think the way that the EU has framed its relations with China endures. This four-part framing: a cooperation partner, a negotiating partner, an economic competitor, and a strategic rival. I think that neatly encapsulates the way that Europeans are seeing China. And even though the UK has left the EU, I think those that would probably characterize UK thinking too. Interesting to see how NATO as an alliance is starting to think about China as well. Increasing skepticism. Worth remembering that Jens Stoltenberg was the Norwegian Prime Minister when the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to Liu Xiaobo, and the subsequent sanctions or unofficial sanctions that China imposed on Norway as a result. But I think NATO looking at a whole of society approach, explicitly warning about risks to civilian infrastructure, supply chains, and cyber threats and things. We're seeing, I think, a hardening up on this side of the Atlantic in attitudes towards China in general, and that's leading to a series of measures, I think, to try and shore up a multilateral system in the region, the independence of small and medium-sized states, offering support wherever possible. And I guess that's the context in which we'll see the carrier strike group going through the region, trying to make as many port visits as possible and showing some kind of support and solidarity, albeit for a temporary period, with those smaller states who I think are anxious about being left alone to face a new economic and military power in the region. Shall I finish there?
Thank you, Bill. That's fantastic. And I thank you for linking in the South China Sea disputes and what's happening there with the wider environment, not only in the Indo-Pacific, but also the transatlantic relationship and how attitudes are absolutely changing when it comes to China. I have a question for you already prepared, but before we go on to the question and answer session, I'm going to first hand it over to Greg. Greg, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Vera. So I'm going to try to pick up with the question of why we are at a point in the South China Sea in which the international community in Europe seems so concerned. And I think that it's clear that international attention, and particularly European attention, is higher now in the South China Sea than it's been since at least early 2016, in the run-up to the arbitration ruling. And after July 2016, for about 5 years, I think Europe very happily decided to ignore the South China Sea again, partially in response, as I think Bill indicated, to Hungarian and Greek choices, but I think the rest of Europe embraced the pass that was given them by Hungarian and Greek refusal to move. The problem is, of course, the South China Sea didn't go away, and so China completed its artificial island building around 2016, about the same time that the ruling came out. And by the end of 2017, it had effectively militarized those islands. I mean, the talk we're having today about militarization is a bit of a misnomer. Really, what we're talking about is how China is using these now fully militarized outposts. So let me quickly share screen and show where things stand today. So the biggest change in the South China Sea over the last 5 years hasn't really been in the naval or missile or air force capabilities of China, though all of those are extremely important and very worrying for US war planning. The biggest change has been in the ability of Beijing to express its de facto administration over waters, airspace, and seabed. It used to be the case that China was 800, 900, in some cases 1,000 miles from the resources and the waters that Beijing was claiming. Today, China is at most 100, 150 miles from the resources it's claiming, because it now is able to forward deploy dozens of government vessels and hundreds of militia vessels in the Spratly Islands off the coast of the Philippines and Malaysia and Vietnam. And that also gives it a significant numerical advantage that it didn't enjoy even 5 years ago, because 5 years ago, Chinese patrols at places like Luconia Shoals, Second Thomas Shoal, Scarborough Shoal, Vanguard Bank that I'm showing here, none of which are actually occupied by China, but all of which are in some sense symbolically important for China. These consisted of Chinese ships going down, flying the flag, throwing a sovereignty marker over the side, taking some pictures, and then going back home 800 miles. Today, there's a China Coast Guard ship on patrol at every one of these features pretty much 24/7. And it is really wearing down the ability of Southeast Asian partners, even those who want to respond, to be able to do so. It's in many ways analogous to what we have seen for many years in the East China Sea with the Japanese, or increasingly on the Himalayan border with the Indians. The need to respond to this constant Chinese presence is wreaking havoc on the readiness and the ability of coast guards and navies from the region, who just don't have enough boats. They don't have enough sailors. They don't have they can't keep that many people out on patrol that often. It is a real grind, and one that is slowly squeezing them out of their own waters. This has been most apparent on the oil and gas front if you read news, because those tend to be the standoffs that attract the most attention, and they are those that are most dangerous. The fishery standoffs are a daily occurrence, but ones that often fly under the radar. And this has targeted the Vietnamese for many years, but last year we started really seeing the Malaysians come in for the same kind of treatment. So there was a 6-month standoff between the China Coast Guard and Chinese fishing militia vessels on one side, trying to prevent the operations of the West Capella, which was a drilling ship contracted by Malaysia's Petronas. And to Malaysia's credit, they didn't back down. They had to deploy a pretty large number of Coast Guard and naval vessels for 6 months to keep the West Capella operating safely, but they did keep it up. But it sent a real chilling message. If that is the kind of operation that Malaysia has to undertake in order to protect every single drilling operation in the South China Sea, pretty soon they're going to find no buyers for any of their drilling operations in the South China Sea. And that is already the case for Vietnam, who has seen over the last few years basically all foreign investment, all foreign interest in its offshore oil and gas fields dry up. Today, they've basically got Rosneft and Exxon's likely to pull out. Not because it's not profitable, not because it's impossible to drill off the coast of Vietnam, but because it's just too risky and too dangerous. And it's really hard to go into a boardroom and insist that it's a good idea to invest in a field off the coast of Da Nang or off the coast of Palawan or Sabah, knowing that you're going to have to deal with constant games of chicken from China Coast Guard vessels and militia vessels threatening to ram your workers. When Malaysia and Vietnam haven't backed down, the other thing we've increasingly seen is China deploy its own state-owned survey vessels to operate off the coast of these states. We saw it off Vietnam in 2019, and then last year we saw it for the last month or so of that standoff with the West Capella. And again, the necessity of Southeast Asians to respond to these Chinese surveys puts an enormous burden on their law enforcement vessels, who frankly have other things that they're supposed to be doing and can't spend every day of the year following around Chinese survey vessels at a safe distance in order to show that they object to their activities. Particularly when, as it was the case with this survey by China, the Chinese survey vessels are surrounded by a dozen Chinese militia boats, fishing vessels who don't actually fish, who are in most cases larger than the Malaysian Navy or Coast Guard boats trying to stop them. So it creates an enormous risk of collision. It creates an enormous burden on the services in South Asia to respond. And little by little, it is creating de facto Chinese administration, as the ability of particularly civilians in Southeast Asia to access their own waters decreases. All of the objections from the US and Japan and Australia and Europe about not recognizing Chinese claims begin to ring more and more hollow, because on the water, it sure looks like the South China Sea is increasingly a Chinese lake. The most important component of this increasingly is not the China Coast Guard, but the Chinese maritime militia. And this is where the numerical advantage on China's part really comes into full focus. So it's one thing to say that China has a dozen Coast Guard vessels operating off the coast of Malaysia or Vietnam every day of the year. It's another thing to point out that China has about 300 other state-directed vessels, all of which look at first glance like fishing vessels, operating in the waters of the Philippines, Malaysia, and Vietnam every day of the year. This is a picture of Subi Reef, one of China's 3 large bases in the Spratlys that were completed in 2016. And as the infrastructure at Subi Reef, along with Mischief Reef, which has the other largest harbor, were completed over the course of 2016, 2017, 2018, what we saw was a huge increase in the presence of militia vessels. These vessels stopped operating out of Hainan and Guangdong most of the time and started being forward deployed for weeks or even months at a time in the Spratlys, much as the Coast Guard has. And when I say militia, I want to be very clear that I'm not using colorful language here. This is an explicit part of China's state-directed forces in the South China Sea. Under China's military service law, all young men who leave active service are required to register for the militia. If they happen to be from a fishing village, they do their militia service aboard a fishing boat. For decades, that meant occasionally getting called up to do weekend warrior service, training, whatever, with the PLA or the CCG. But over the last decade and a half, we have seen a professionalization of a component of this militia that has been very well documented within China. Xi Jinping famously went down in 2013 to Tanmen, where one of these vanguard militia units is hosted, and thanked them for their service. There were billboards with Xi Jinping and the militia of Tanmen speckled all over China. It is only in the Western press that Chinese diplomats try to pretend that there's no such thing as a militia. Within China, this is not even an open secret. It is just open knowledge. Now, by the end of 2018, the militia stopped operating mostly in the harbors at Subi and Mischief Reefs, and they started really throwing their weight around in the rest of the Spratlys. This became most apparent early on at T2 Island. This is the largest island occupied by the Philippines, and where the Filipinos in December of 2018 decided they were going to start some long overdue repairs. Most especially, you can tell that runway is crumbling into the ocean. They also wanted to build a new small harbor to bring boats in, and a beaching ramp to allow them to bring up heavy construction equipment. So this photo was taken on December 20th, 2018. That exact same day, this photo was taken. So to frame this photo, B2 Island I just showed you is just off to the right side of the photo, just to the east. And just off the left side is Subi Reef, that big Chinese base I showed earlier. They're only 12 miles apart. 95 Chinese fishing boats poured out of Subi Reef the day that that barge showed up at D2, and they dropped anchor between 2 and 5 miles from D2 Island. And they stayed there, and they stayed. And sometimes the numbers went up to over 100, and sometimes they went down to 1 or 2 dozen, but they never left. For 2.5 years, most of those boats that previously operated, that previously tied themselves up in the harbor at Subi, have now just been tying up off the coast of D2 Island, off the Philippines. The same number of vessels. We still, when we look around the Spratlys, see overall about 250 to 300 Chinese fishing boats that don't seem to be doing any fishing. But they are no longer just hanging out within Chinese bases. They're now hanging out right off the coast of Filipino and Vietnamese-held islands. To their credit, for 2.5 years, the Filipinos also didn't give up. They had to seriously delay the construction work, but they have continued their upgrades at D2, and it is nearly finished. And then we saw another, most recently, another crisis over the militia break out in early March. This is a picture of Whitsun Reef. So Whitsun's been in the news a lot lately. It's one component of a larger reef structure in the Spratlys called Union Banks. Union Banks actually hosts 4 different Vietnamese military bases and 2 Chinese military bases. The Filipinos don't occupy it at all, but it sits within 200 miles of the Philippine coast. So it's claimed by the Philippines as part of their exclusive economic zone. The Filipinos noticed that there were about 200 of these Chinese militia boats hanging out at Whitsun Reef, tied up. I mean, as you can see in this picture, most of them are tied up in long lines. About half the boats here are trawlers. And I don't know if anybody's ever gone trawling, but you kind of have to move. So if you're riding an anchor, you're not trawling. None of the others have nets in the water. And they hung out for months at a time. This photo was actually taken last September. This isn't even from the current standoff in February, March. February, March just seems to be when the Filipinos realized it. The vessels have actually been operating at Union Banks and specifically at Whitsun Reef for at least the last year. And so much as at D2, what we've seen is the boats who used to operate in Mischief Reef in particular have now spread out into other parts of the Spratlys. So the 300 Chinese militia fleet is now operating mainly around Vietnamese outposts in Union Banks and around D2 Island for the Filipinos, making it all but impossible for Filipino fishermen to operate, constantly harassing Filipino and Vietnamese surveillance, patrol ships, and especially the resupply vessels that come in and out. And I think this speaks to one of the real keys for the international community, both US and Europe. The only way to confront this kind of huge numerical advantage, these paramilitary forces, is not to try to chase them around in an endless game of whack-a-mole, but to publicize their activity and impose diplomatic and economic costs on Beijing for using them. This is an illegal paramilitary. illegal under multiple different components of international law, and clearly escalatory. And it's in Beijing's interest to pretend it doesn't exist. So the fact that the Filipino government has gone out for the last 2 months and started taking pictures of the hull numbers of all of these boats has been quite helpful. In fact, it's allowed us to start tracking every vessel at Whitsun Reef back to its home port in China, where presumably one could start looking for hypothetical sanctions, or at the very least, naming and shaming bad actors who should be blacklisted from other activity. And only if the international community, the US and Europe, are able to basically treat China the way that we've treated Russia ever since the annexation of Crimea, and certainly the support of paramilitaries in eastern Ukraine, can we expect to see China start to ratchet back its over-reliance on this dangerous paramilitary? Because the answer is not for the US and its partners to try to counter ship for ship Chinese activity in the South China Sea. That's a hopeless race that we are destined to lose. The trick is to disincentivize Beijing from continuing this bad behavior. And I will wrap up there.
Thank you, Greg. I mean, that was absolutely fascinating. And thank you for showing us some of that data collection as well, which has been really phenomenal in shedding light on the situation and trying to get to grips as to what the actual challenge really is that countries in the region, but also other interested countries are dealing with on a day-to-day basis there. We already have a couple of questions coming in. I would encourage everybody to keep submitting their questions in the Q&A box. But maybe just to get us started, question for you, Bill. You mentioned that obviously following the 2016 tribunal case, that European Union countries, Europe more broadly, followed suit after Hungary and Greece took a more toned down approach to reacting to it. And we're happy to do so. How do you see the current environment in Europe potentially affecting or supporting a transatlantic approach to the South China Sea? How is that going to look like? And Greg, when it comes to countries in the region, how do they view, I guess, this extra regional interest, continued extra regional interest in the South China Sea, given the kind of below the threshold challenges that they're facing? And what are the expectations of them, of, say, the UK and the United States? I'll leave it to, well, Bill is smiling, so I'm going to hand over to Bill first.
Since you gave me the fiendishly difficult question. Well, I mean, part of the problem, I guess, with Europe and its support or lack of for the tribunal ruling was, as Greg pointed out, was that, it came just 12 days after President Duterte took office, and Europe can't be more Catholic than the Pope, as it were. So if the Philippines isn't going to stand up for its rights, then it's very hard for the Europeans to do so. Can't get behind anything. So that's been a problem. Nonetheless, of course, those states that do see themselves as having an interest in law of the sea generally, the UK, France, Germany in particular, have made their own statements. Little sort of caveat that the UK has various uninhabited islands around the world that it doesn't really want to talk about its exclusive economic zone rights there anyway, but that's a kind of caveat. So yeah, and obviously, there are landlocked states within the European Union who maybe don't pay so much attention to maritime issues. And of course, there's the whole question of how European states are going to balance their relationship with China. For a long time, there's sort of been a joke, really, that EU China policy has been written in the boardroom of Volkswagen. I think we might be coming to a sort of a transition point in that, particularly I think as Angela Merkel retires from the leadership in Germany, we may see a change of approach. And I think that the way that China has handled the response to the criticism of its Uyghur camps and how that's affected the way that the European Parliament will treat the China investment agreement. I mean, all of these things seem to kind of suggest a new mood in relations. I think the fact that we don't have Donald Trump in the White House means that we're much more likely to see some kind of coordination, at least between the UK, sorry, between the US and Europe. And I put the UK in that as well on matters to do with China, but that doesn't mean they're going to see eye to eye. I mean, Josep Borrell, the EU High Representative for Foreign Policy, he's basically said quite openly, we don't see ourselves as forming an anti-China alliance. But I think, what we're seeing is an attempt by the EU to offer something, as an alternative. Which is sort of rules-based and multilateral and all the things that the EU likes to do, which will in some ways intersect with what the US wants, but in other ways perhaps not. So I think it's going to be an interesting time. Reminder of Churchill's saying about, if you can't ride two horses at the same time, you shouldn't be in the circus. And I think that's kind of where the UK, but also to some extent the EU is going to find itself.
Thank you. And Greg, few from the region.
Yeah, so the region is obviously not of one mind on this or anything else. As Bill indicated, one of the biggest hurdles to getting international focus and sustaining it on the South China Sea has been the dysfunction within the region, the refusal of the Philippines to lead on its own behalf, and then the refusal of anybody else to step in and do it for them. What you've had for most of the last 5 years has been the Vietnamese kind of out on a limb by themselves, but Vietnam is not very eager, nor is it well acquainted with kind of public diplomacy in this sense, right? The Vietnamese are not comfortable going up in front of the UN and banging the podium and condemning China. As we saw throughout the course of the Philippine arbitration case from 2013 to 2016, Vietnam is much more comfortable letting others take the lumps, while Hanoi quietly messages to Beijing that it agrees. And so Vietnam has found itself in a real pickle where it doesn't feel like it can go out and advocate for itself, and yet it looks around and has no support within the region. Indonesia has largely done the same. We did see Indonesia stepping up on the fisheries front, particularly under the first Jokowi administration and Fisheries Minister Susi Pujiastuti, but that's largely been abandoned. And Indonesia has been, while still the largest party in the region, certainly not leading Southeast Asia in any viable sense. And the Malaysians are far too busy with their own political turmoil to think, beyond anything in KL. So what you've mostly had is Kuala Lumpur getting mad at anybody who talks about the South China Sea, be they friend or foe. What seems to have changed over the last year is the Philippines are finally coming off the fence a bit. The Duterte government, probably in spite of Duterte himself, has grown fed up with continued Chinese harassment in the South China Sea, combined with the complete failure of Beijing to hold up its end of the bargain with Duterte, which was, I will keep quiet on the South China Sea and push the Americans to arm's length if you give me significant aid and investment. And Duterte did all of his part, and almost none of the Chinese aid or investment shown up. And they continue to kick around Filipinos in the South China Sea. So, Duterte is never going to go in front of a microphone and say sorry. Anybody who's been following the Philippine press for the last week has seen Duterte doing quite the opposite. But he's certainly given a lot more space to the Philippine armed forces and the bureaucracy to do what they would like to have done for the last 5 years anyway, which is invite international support. And so the net result of that has been, over the last 12 months, this quiet Vietnamese effort to internationalize the dispute and a more public Filipino willingness to stand up for themselves, I think, has helped facilitate a greater international involvement. And as Bill said, that was most obvious in the statements from the notice verbal from the UK, France, Germany last year on the South China Sea. Although I'll point out that despite those statements, neither France nor Germany has actually called on China to comply with the 2016 arbitration award. And the British government only did so 2 years after the award at a junior level in the Foreign Office.
Quite important last point that you made right there. And I think, when we discuss governance of the kind of global maritime domain and how we should react to some of the challenges, I think consistency in messaging and coordinated messaging is incredibly important. And clearly there's still some work to be done there, even though there is some movement in that. And we've got a lot of questions. One specifically to Greg. When it comes to the maritime militia, do they ever get involved or engaged with U.S. naval deployments So do they, for example, disperse when the US Navy sails nearby? And of course, what can we expect in that sense for HMS Queen Elizabeth when she goes through the region? What might the response be?
Certainly the militia has. Most famously in 2009, when the USS Impeccable was harassed in the South China Sea, it was mostly a group of Chinese militia boats out of Tunmen, which is on Hainan Island, who did the harassing. They cut across its bow and they dropped lumber and flotsam off the front of the boats. One of them was caught on video trying to hook the sonar buoy from the US ship. There have been similar incidents around the same time in the Yellow Sea with other Chinese militia. But those have been, I don't know if they're really exceptions. Those seem to be far outside the norm. Most of what the militia does on a day-to-day basis is harass fellow civilians. So the fishing forces, oil and gas activity, and law enforcement vessels from other Southeast Asian parties. And increasingly, as the Chinese Coast Guard and the Chinese Navy are modernized and more than capable of going toe-to-toe with the US Navy in the South China Sea, I think what you're seeing is a real desire from the uniformed services in China to de-emphasize the role of the militia in those state-to-state encounters, right? The militia's role is to act in the shadows and kick around the Filipinos, not to get in the way of the Americans.
Yeah. Bill, a question that I'm going to direct to you, but Greg, also please jump in if you'd like to answer this one. But there's a question around the reaction of the UK to the 2019 UN court ruling on the ownership and sovereignty of the Chagos Islands in the Indian Ocean region, and whether this strengthens China's ability to ignore, I guess, the protests over its claims and actions in the South China Sea, and what maybe the way forward for the UK is, given that, it is speaking about the rules-based international system and order and the importance of the rule of law.
Great, a nice uncontroversial one. If people aren't familiar with Chagos Islands, if I say the phrase Diego Garcia, that might help them understand. So this is the coral reefs in South China, sorry, in the Indian Ocean that were separated from Mauritius by the UK before independence, and then retained, turned into a very large naval and air base. And people were displaced, and they've been demanding the right to return to their island. And then the International Court of Justice made a ruling that the islands were illegally separated. I mean, I'm not an employee or kind of advocate for the Foreign Office here, but I would say, I mean, I'll tell you what they would say, I think, which is that ICJ ruling was an advisory ruling as opposed to a compulsory ruling, whereas the arbitral tribunal ruling on the South China Sea in 2016 was a compulsory ruling, an award. So therefore, the UK has continued to say that we reject this advisory ruling. I imagine what's going to happen in the real world is that at some point, the Americans will do a deal with the Mauritian government to give them a very long lease on Diego Garcia. And at some point, the UK will quietly end the territorial dispute and maintain access to the naval and other military facilities at Diego Garcia. I mean, I have no inside track on this, but I imagine that's where we're heading. So I guess, yeah, what the UK lawyers would say was that was an advisory ruling. The South China Sea one was compulsory, and so therefore China should comply.
Vera, can I jump in? Because I don't want to step into British politics, though, one party has already said what they'll do if they take power. So I think inevitably there will be some kind of political off-ramp that London will find to make this go away. And what that speaks to is the way that arbitration has traditionally worked for larger powers. The UK is not the only country to have ever insisted that it will never, ever follow an arbitration ruling, and then eventually probably find a politically face-saving way to do exactly that. The US did the same thing under the Reagan administration when we lost the 1986 ICJ decision for support for the Contra rebels in Nicaragua, insisted we would never, ever comply. And then A little under a decade later, we complied and gave Nicaragua an aid package that was basically identical to the reparations the ICJ ordered the US to pay, but we insisted that we didn't pay reparations. We just gave them a check for the same amount for a different reason. The Russians losing the 2014 ITLOS decision over seizure of the Arctic Sunrise effectively came into compliance with the ruling while insisting they did it under domestic law, not because ITLOS told them to. The difference in all of these cases and the 2016 arbitration award is that the UK lost overwhelmingly in the UNGA vote on that ICJ advisory decision. The US lost 3 times in overwhelming UNGA votes on the ICJ decision, and the Russians face overwhelming EU insistence to comply with the ITLOS ruling. Where are the votes on China to comply with the 2016 arbitration award? Who is calling for this? And will the international community actually impose that? Because the reason that great powers do comply with arbitration rulings isn't because they're legally binding. It's not because there's a police force that makes them do it. It's because the reputational cost of being seen as an outlaw in the system isn't worth the effort. And so eventually they find an off-ramp.
I mean, I think that's a really good point, particularly when we talk about, I guess, potential transatlantic coordination on this issue. Is there scope potentially for a stronger campaign behind the scenes, maybe to bring this to light, to see why countries aren't willing to bring this up within the UNGA, for example? I mean, I think everyone has their own ideas about why that may be, but clearly, if there's a willingness for countries to stand up against others, then surely we should be asking the question around why China is not being raised as an issue as well, in terms of standing up and respecting the finding in 2016. When it comes to, I guess, an evolution of kind of pragmatic thinking and an ultimate settling and finding a particularly, I guess, solution to some of these questions, I wonder whether we can talk briefly around the current code of conduct negotiations in the South China Sea, how that is going. What do you both expect to come out of that? And also some of these ideas around joint development of the South China Sea. I mean, is that really, I think, feasible under the current conditions? Is that something that the transatlantic community can support? For example, some of these, I think, proposals have come out of think tanks in DC. I think also CSAS has done that. And there were some really interesting ideas, but given the kind of consistent below the threshold activity, you mentioned the reaction to drilling, the reaction to fishing. How are some of these ideas potentially still alive? How could we maybe action them, or are they really dead in the water? Bill, do you want to maybe go first?
Okay, I'll have a go. Well, the good news is that in November 2018, the Chinese Premier Li Keqiang said that the COC, the Code of Conduct negotiations, will be wrapped up within 3 years. So that means they're all going to be done by November. The bad news is that he was lying, and there's no way that they're going to happen. So, I mean, the same, fundamentally the issue is that the Southeast Asian states want to constrain China's behavior, and China doesn't want its behavior constrained. And the Southeast Asian countries lack any leverage to get China to agree to constrain its behavior. So therefore they'll keep on talking and talking. And we've had, this year will be the 25th anniversary of the start of talks about possibly having a COC. So a quarter of a century it's taken and we're still not there. We've had a declaration, we've had a framework, we've had guidelines, we now have a single draft negotiating text. I think we'll just have a more elegant name for a piece of paper that isn't quite a COC. And the same issues just keep coming round and round. The Vietnamese want to include the Paracel Islands, the Philippines want to include Scarborough Shoal. China doesn't want either of those things. They only wants to talk about the Spratly Islands. There's a whole question whether it should be legally binding or not, and what does that mean? And then, a whole lot of other issues get chucked in as to whether one country could be able to veto all the other countries having military exercises, for example, which none of the Southeast Asian countries wish to accept. So I'm a skeptic. The good thing about the Code of Conduct is that it provides a venue for the people to talk, for the various claimants to talk about the the disputes and kind of reduce some of the tension, but it isn't going to live up, I think, to its hopes. That said, I will hand over to Greg because I know I've been partly involved in some of his efforts to actually get something that would lead us closer to a COC.
Yeah, that's right. Bill was part of our expert working group in 2018, so we can't entirely disavow the efforts. No, I mean, look, Bill's absolutely right. So the Philippines was tasked by ASEAN to draft the first draft of the ASEAN Code of Conduct in 1998. And China responded in 1999 with its draft. And they could find no room for compromise. And so the result was the 2001 non-binding Declaration on 2002 Declaration on Conduct. And so if you look at the leaked draft that exists today of the current negotiations, the ones that were leaked at the end of 2018, they are identical to the 1999 Chinese draft. We have moved nowhere. And if anything, we have gone backwards in time. We have lost ground from what ASEAN had done for the last 20 years. There's simply no political will to compromise on Beijing's side. And there's not a lot on the Southeast Asian side either, but fundamentally, the biggest guy in the room has to be the one that shows them energy to move. And China is not interested in moving. Any code of conduct that would come out of the current process is, as Bill said, not going to restrain China in any way. And if the demand from the South Asians is that it must restrain China, then Beijing's preference is to just keep talking forever. Because, I mean, as I just showed, Beijing is in greater control today than it was a year ago, certainly in greater control than it was 20 years ago. And if this continues in 10 years, it'll be a moot point. There will be no oil and gas drilling or fishing or any other civilian activity that happens without China say so. And then the code of conduct will be whatever the heck China tells them they're going to sign. So the only way to break that logjam, I think, is to go outside of the ASEAN context. Let ASEAN keep talking about the code of conduct. Who cares? It's a lovely confidence building mechanism that's been going on for the better part of my life, and they can keep doing it. But if they're going to have a real discussion that will act with the urgency the moment requires, it has to happen without Laos and Myanmar and Thailand in the room. It has to be among the claimants and China, talking about fisheries, talking about oil and gas, talking about law enforcement, codes of conduct, things like that. None of which are even in the code of conduct right now. Like, even if they wrap this thing up that they're talking about, there is no chapter on fisheries in the current draft code of conduct. There is no chapter on oil and gas exploration. It is basically the preamble. They've spent the last 30 years arguing about the preamble to a code of conduct.
But do you see any willingness for or any kind of movement on, say, an abandonment of the ASEAN process or a parallel track to that ASEAN process? Or do you think we're just very far away from that?
I think the Vietnamese have continuously tiptoed around this question for the last several years and found no takers. I think if the Filipinos put their hands up and said, we are ready to talk about this, then they will find an eager audience in Hanoi. And then, KL won't be all that helpful, but Jakarta will insist that it be in the room rather than outside. So the Indonesians will come in, at least in the fisheries front. They tried this in 2015. They had a series of trilateral meetings between the foreign ministers of the Philippines, Malaysia, and Vietnam, which eventually broke up, mostly because the Chinese gave just enough to make it go away and the Bruneians wouldn't take part. But as Vietnam faces increasingly dire straits on its offshore energy industry, and the Filipinos move into the lame duck era of Duterte and hopefully a post-Duterte presidency, there could be some effort to move, because the alternative is to just lose everything they have, right? I mean, eventually China will present them a fait accompli, and the code of conduct is not going to stop that.
I mean, just building on that, do you think, and Bill as well, do you think that there is potentially an inflection point that may necessitate a kind of a more coordinated or minilateral group amongst Southeast Asia to try and move the dial forwards, or do you think that Beijing will likely just continue this gradual approach, continue with below the threshold actions, and then just kind of, as you say, build towards a fait accompli at the end?
Shall I go? Okay.
Sure. Yeah.
Well, I think one thing is that the commitment to ASEAN unity is pretty strong, and I think that's the main thing, that there's never really been a desire to have an ASEAN minus framework, because of the sense that it might weaken ASEAN, although ASEAN's pretty weak, but it provides a useful shield for a lot of people. I mean, you'd have thought that, I mean, the Philippines gets 20% of its national electricity generation from gas that comes out of the Malampaya gas field in the South China Sea, which is expected to run out within 5-10 years. Now, there's an awful lot of gas thought to be under the Reed Bank, and it wouldn't take too much effort to connect that to the existing pipelines and keep the lights on in Manila. But actually, the Philippines is dithering, talking about building, gas import terminals to bring in Australian or American gas, rather than develop the gas that's sitting underneath their exclusive economic zone. So the fact that the Philippines is willing to ignore, its potential loss of 1/5 of its electricity generating output, and it still hasn't concentrated its mind, suggests that it's going to take something enormous to make it change its attitude towards this. I don't know what Greg thinks.
Yeah, I think Bill's right. I thought that the coming energy crunch might have been the thing that would do this. It clearly hasn't. Partially, I think, because the Philippines hasn't come to grips with reality. It is already too late for the Philippines to tap the gas at Reed Bank and make a difference. They can't possibly get that project online fast enough to replace the supply at Malampaya. And so they're going to have to, what they're probably going to end up doing is taking a whole bunch of Chinese funded coal plants in Luzon to make up the difference, because the alternative is brownouts in Manila in the summer months. And so that hasn't worked. The fish stock collapse is coming in the next 5 to 10 years, but that's probably unavoidable and will be, it'll happen kind of very gradually and then very suddenly. And by the time it's sudden, it's too late to do anything. If there's going to be an impetus to move, I think it could happen post Duterte. It'll come from a political decision in Hanoi and Manila. And if that doesn't happen, then the only likely impetus would be a significant loss of life at sea on the part of the Philippines. And even then, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, a Chinese militia boat rammed and sank a Philippine fishing boat 2 years ago and left the entire crew in the water to die. And luckily, a Vietnamese boat came by and rescued them. And Manila's response to that was basically to blame its own mariners rather than point the finger at China. So I'm not even sure that a loss of life will turn the ship in Manila at this point, but I am hopeful. I'm not so cynical that I would keep doing this if I thought it was already game over.
There's a question about whether there may be a leadership role for the UK in maybe uniting some of these countries. I mean, you've just both highlighted some of the difficulties anyways. Is there kind of a political convening role that the UK could play in this? And maybe to Greg, what can we expect from the Biden administration with regard to the South China Sea? You've mentioned kind of naming and shaming activities already underway, in part, of course, by fantastic work like AMTI. But what kind of other policy avenues do you think we can expect from the Biden administration? Bill, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think a UK leadership role might be stretching it a bit too far. I think the UK is definitely very interested in encouraging countries in the region to, assert themselves and or their own rights and to work together. Certainly the Foreign Office has in the UK has been convening conferences and discussions to try and sort of gauge opinion and see what room there is for sort of, working together, both in Europe and in the region and between the two parts of the world. But I don't think we're suddenly going to see a kind of a London announcement or conference or something that's going to try and resolve these things. I don't think it would be welcome. I mean, the UK clearly has, strong post-imperial links, with Singapore, Malaysia, Brunei. Let's not talk about Burma, Myanmar. And so, those kind of ring, and they're important. But, I don't think there's any sense that we're going to kind of come back in and say, this is how you should run your China policy. I just don't think that's going to happen.
So I think the US has two things on its mind, or at least I hope it does, on the South China Sea. One is the short-term need to shore up deterrence and fix the US-Philippine alliance, which is, hopefully it avoids a disaster, which could be coming in 3 months. In 3 months, the US-Philippine Visiting Forces Agreement is supposed to be abrogated. which would require the US to pull all counter-terror forces out of the Philippines, basically gut all of our joint exercises and port visits, and send a pretty clear message to the Chinese that there is no American help coming should they ever actually kill somebody in the South China Sea. So you've got to avoid that cliff. And I'm cautiously optimistic. Duterte hasn't been getting in the way of negotiations. The Biden administration is keeping these quiet because the Philippines is a very touchy issue in the US Congress right now, given human rights concerns. And so if they can do that and shore up deterrence, that hopefully keeps Manila in the contest for a while and convinces Beijing that the US treaty commitment to the Philippines is real, which I don't know that Beijing actually believes at the moment. The second is the long-term question of, can you actually name and shame Beijing and impose enough cost outside the military domain that Beijing looks for compromise? And in this, I think the way we should think about it is that not just the US, but the whole international community's job is to be the bad cop, so that when the Philippines or Vietnam or Malaysia come to China with joint development schemes, there is a greater incentive to take them, to seize that opportunity rather than keep putting up with international isolation. And there I'm a little hopeful. I mean, the one thing that the Trump team, obviously, they were very good at yelling things about China. They were just doing it into a void. The one thing the Biden team can hopefully do is actually help coordinate international pressure, particularly transatlantic pressure. Because if it's just, as we've seen, if it's just Tokyo, Canberra, and Washington, Beijing doesn't care.
And maybe just on that point, there is a question and a couple of mentions on the Quad, of course, unsurprisingly. Bill, do you think the UK will join the Quad? And Greg, do you think the Quad or Quad plus plus has a role in the South China Sea?
I don't think the UK will join the Quad. I mean, the Quad, everybody else in the Quad is in the region, and I think it'll be a bit weird to have a country that isn't in the Quad. But bear in mind that obviously the United States is our most crucial security ally on so many fronts. We're linked to Australia through the Five Eyes arrangements. We have increasing ties with Japan. I think we'd like better ties. The UK would like much better ties with India. On trade and security. I think we're jealous that the French seem to have better ties with India than the UK does. India's always wanted concessions on UK immigration controls as part of any price. Interesting to note that, was it last week or the week before, the UK and India signed a new migration and mobility agreement. So maybe things are starting to be a bit unlocked in that direction. But no, I don't think formal membership of the Quad is likely.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I don't think anybody, UK or anybody else, is going to be invited. The Indians barely like having Australia there. They're certainly not eager to expand the remit any. And Delhi has been extremely clear that it does not want any more formalization of the Quad. The Quad is to be whatever each party wants it to be, but we're not supposed to actually say what it is. I do think that obviously maritime security is one of the connective tissues that keeps all four parties together. It's in all the statements. It got highlighted at the leaders meeting. It's the one area where everybody's on the same page, although India increasingly thinks that the South China Sea is lost and we should all spend a lot more time on the Indian Ocean. But still, clearly getting India more on board with any diplomatic effort to name and shame Beijing and raise this issue significantly increases the cost, because then it's no longer just American allies doing it, it's a non-aligned party, and India brings a significant amount of heft. But the most important thing for the Quad at the moment is getting this vaccine diplomacy effort right. If the number one goal of the Quad is to prove to particularly Southeast Asian states that democracies are still capable of delivering public goods, that Beijing is not the only one that can still do things. And if they can actually deliver 1 billion vaccine doses by the end of next year in the region, that will be a once in a generation, soft power win. Increasingly, the rate of, COVID infections in India and the repeated slowdowns on AstraZeneca disbursement through COVAX because of the slowdown in India has me, and I think a lot of South Asians, worried that the Quad's not going to be able to follow through on this commitment. And so if they can't get that right, if they can't show South Asia that they can deliver on COVID, South Asia is not going to get on board with anything else the Quad tries to do, including on the South China Sea.
Thank you so much for that. I'm afraid that we've run out of time now officially. It's been an absolutely whirlwind discussion. We've touched so many different topics and covered a lot of ground. I know that I still have a million questions to ask you both, and I'm sure the audience feels the same way. But for now, at least, thank you so much both for your time and for giving us such an insightful hour to update us on the current events within the South China Sea and how the transatlantic community is thinking about that. So thank you so much for your time, and thank you to our audience for joining us today as well.